Reality is really, really big, and we perceive a very small part of it through sensory input. And our senses are scientific resonance sensors for tracking energy patterns. That's what we compose into reality. We take a variety of different data sources and we make patterns out of them. And when we can name those patterns, we consider it real. So let's look through how much of reality we perceive and how we put it together. So we have a couple of different sensors. We have language, which correlates to thought. If you try and think a thought without language, you can't think a thought. In other words, try and think a single thought without any language. And so this is one of our sensors. We create thought patterns through language, and then we remember the thought patterns, and we also imagine a future with thought patterns. And so this is one of our key constructs of reality, is on the dimension of thought, which is also the dimension of language. Now, we also have feelings, and we can look at the human heart as a scientific instrument that communicates what's going on by producing a full spectrum of feelings. So if we're mad, there's a good chance something's going on in reality that's blocking something important to us. That's when we get mad. If we want to move and cars are in front of us and blocking our movement, we may feel anger, we may feel impatience. It's a continuum, but the frustration comes from resistance. And so the purpose of the sense of feeling is to communicate what's going on in our outer and inner environment, because obviously it's influenced strongly by our beliefs. If we believe that we're going to fail in life unless we're always moving quickly, then a traffic jam is going to correlate with a thought that says, I'm going to fail in life because I'm wasting time. Another thought, another belief. And so obviously we're going to experience a sense of frustration. Why? Because we have another belief that failure is bad and painful, and so we don't want to fail. We want to succeed. And if we believe the way to do that is to move quickly, then we will feel mad, frustrated, depressed when we find ourselves stuck or in a slow place. And so feelings are giving us readings of the interplay between thoughts, beliefs, pictures out of those thoughts and beliefs, and the surrounding environment. And obviously we believe or have a feeling that we don't like pain. And so if a needle is poking into our hand, we're going to get the feeling that says, I don't like that. That's painful. That's what pain means. That's not what I want to be, to be happening, and it's happening. So we perceive reality through feeling. But in the outer dimensions of reality, we perceive stimulation in forms of touch. And these are scientific sensors equipped in our own body. And I say resonance sensors because it's just another word for stimulation. All reality comes to us in a form, in an energy pattern that we read as stimulation. And so one of the ways that we experience that stimulation is touch. And it's in the touch bandwidth there's a lot of things that touch us that we don't pick up through the touch sense. And so there is a touch of air. There's a movement of air, but I can't quite feel it, meaning our touch has a certain sensitivity threshold. And there's a lot of stimulation that is not loud enough, so to speak, to awaken awareness in the way that an actual touch will. But if we get loud enough, now the air starts to move, and we do register it. And so we register a certain amount of stuff in the continuum of touch. We also have sound, and in the spectrum of sound, we hear certain things. There's actually a sound going on right now. There's a sound. See, if we rub, there's awareness of the sound. There's a sound in this movement. We can't hear it, but it is there. So what we have are these 5 different senses that are designed to pick up different frequencies of energy. And if it doesn't, like for example, this one isn't at an amplitude that we pick up the sound, isn't at an amplitude that we pick up the touch over here, but it is at an amplitude where we pick up the visual awareness. So we're still collecting data, even though my hand here isn't feeling the data. Even though my ears are not hearing the data, I'm still seeing the data. I'm seeing what's going on. I'm not hearing it. I'm not feeling it. I'm not smelling it. And this is why we have a spectrum of scientific instruments inside our body that can register information. We've also got taste, and I'm not tasting this either. But taste is another vehicle for grasping what's going on. And we have sight, and we have smell. I'm not. So the one thing that I'm picking up here is I'm feeling the movement here. But if this was a stick moving here, I would feel nothing, smell nothing, taste nothing, hear nothing, but I could still see it. And so we have this spread of sensory input and sensory measuring devices. And the purpose of this is to get a sense of how big reality is outside of our observing and measuring devices. And I picked this thing up from NASA because one of the interesting things about our sensory data input devices, our senses, is that we have these amplitudes, these energy spectrums, and our senses can pick up a little bit. And so if we look at the spectrum from 10 hertz to I think it's 10,000 hertz. So we've got a range from 10 hertz to 10,000 hertz. You can see a very small percentage of that will show up in the light spectrum that is readable by the human eye. And if the energy presents itself outside of the bandwidth of what we can see, we don't see it. It's there, but we don't see it. And this spectrum goes through VLF, which is in the 10 to 1 kilohertz range. Then we go into the radio spectrum, where we have low frequency, high frequency, in the 10 kilohertz to 1 megahertz, 10 megahertz, etc. Up at around 100 gigahertz, or 10 terahertz, we then go into the visual range. And it's a pretty small range. So we hit infrared, we don't see infrared, but it's there. We go into then ultraviolet, we don't see ultraviolet, but it's there. We then go into X-ray, we don't see X-ray, but it's there. We go into gamma ray, and then we go into cosmic rays, which has a spectrum. Again, we don't see them. We can develop scientific instruments that do see them. And this brings me to the next point, which is that on each of the ports of data that we have available to us, we have a very, very tiny bandwidth. Because, this sheet, for example, measures from 10 hertz, up to, let's say, 10 terahertz. And excuse the ignorance of the exact terminology. But the point is, why are we stopping at 10 hertz? What about 1,000th or 1/billionth of 1 hertz? You see, these markers that we make on these infinite continuums of energy are very arbitrary. Why are we using 10-point increments? Because we have a 10-base number system. Why not have a 100-point number system? Why not have a 13-point number system? They're very, very arbitrary. We just decide that in our number system that when we come to 10, we'll repeat the process. And so we'll go to 11, which is 1 again. So we're repeating in cycles of 10. But this is completely arbitrary. We could repeat every 5 numbers. We could just eliminate 6, 7, and we could repeat every 5, or we could repeat after 100 numbers. Then we could go up again. It's completely random. And things can be broken down. If you think of the color spectrum, for example, where we think of maybe 7 colors, but basic colors, but computers break them down into 256 million different colors. That's not because the color spectrum can't be broken down further. You could break the color spectrum down into 1 billion colors. It just is beyond our ability to even track. If you have a computer show us a shade of red that is 1,000th of a shade different from the red that we're looking at, we don't really see the difference. And so it's not really relevant to our eyes that it's 1,000th of a shade darker or lighter on the reds, on the red continuum. And so we take the vastness of reality and we reduce it down to a level at which the pattern seems relevant to us. And so, within language and thought, for example, we may have a bandwidth, the range of thought that we may think throughout our lifetime, maybe from here to here. But that's not all the thoughts that could be thought. Those are not all the words that could be spoken. In fact, anthropologists suggest that there have been 10,000 languages in human history, more than 600 being present on the planet today. And each flavor of each word combines a pattern in a different way. And so each language creates meaning or creates thought in a slightly different way. I enjoyed a TED Talk recently where they were referring to unusual languages or unusual meanings of words that we don't have in English. And in Denmark or in the Danish language, there's a word that means kind of a warm, cozy home, all in one. We have to say warm, cozy home, a bit like this, a bit like this. They have it in one word. The Eskimos had up to 400 words for snow. We have to say wet snow, dry snow. We have to add these adjectives, but they had unique words for wet snow and all in one word. And so when you combine patterns in a different way, like we're separating wet from white powdery stuff. And so we're saying white powdery stuff, that's wet. So we're keeping those two distinct. And in that distinction, we're creating a different version of the organizational structure of reality than if we see the wetness and the whiteness as one versus two separate things. And so what language does is it takes the full spectrum of reality and it divides it up into particles. And as a particle, depending on the unit of the particle, that's the unit of the word, we can then combine it with other particles, which are other words, and get a sense of meaning. Not meaning, a sense of meaning. Because wet isn't actually wet, it's a sound. It's a translation of wet to take something sensory, wet, into the audio spectrum, to take stuff from the sense of nerves to the sense of hearing. And in doing so, work with reality through imagination. So what we think is a very small amount of all the thoughts that could be thought. Like you may never, in an entire lifetime, have had the thought of a construction worker hanging upside down in a 26 centigrade vat of oil with 1 inch of water on top. Why would you think of it? It's not relevant. And so, to most of our lives. So it's there as a possible thought within the English language, but we never think it. And so we have a very narrow band of thought within the full possibility of thought contained in all the different ways that our language could be combined. But the way that one could think, if one looked at the same object in the same life through 10,000 different languages, is different. Meaning it's not just that we haven't had that thought. We haven't had many of the thoughts that are familiar to us seen through the lens of different languages. And the language is part of the lens, which determines a large part of reality. So we've got this very narrow band of thought, this very narrow band of language. Now, within the spectrum of feelings, there are also feelings are as vast as the color spectrum. So we could have mad, glad, sad, happy, joy, whatever. We can have a very low resolution experience of human feeling. Or we can have a 256 million distinct digitization of the feeling spectrum. And many of us have not tuned in a culture that does not teach a single hour of emotional literacy in its entire curriculum. Many of us have not developed an attunement to the sense, the sensory instrument of the human heart. The human heart produces a sensation, a feeling, an awareness that is designed to tell us about our relationship to that situation. And many of us don't read that instrument very, very clearly or carefully because we've not only never been taught a single hour of formal emotional literacy, but because we are discouraged in our culture from emphasizing feelings. We prefer the thought bandwidth. So different cultures, of which there have been 10,000 at least and in human history, emphasize different things. And more feeling cultures will emphasize more empathy and awareness to feelings. More thought cultures will emphasize the same data, but they will come through a refraction of thought. So we have relatively low relatively low levels of distinction in human feelings. And then we've also decided in our culture, as every cult decides different things are okay and not okay, that certain feelings either don't exist or are inappropriate. And so we've also made some of our emotional continuums unconscious as a way of dissociating from them because they're not admissible in the cult. Much like certain evidence is decided it's not admissible in court. Like you can be in a court and you can say, well, 10,000 people all say that their hands are tingling because they're touching their cell phone. And the court can say, well, was that done in a laboratory? And you can say, no, it was done in my life. You know, it's in my life. I'm not in a laboratory when my hands are tingling. I'm driving to work, etc. And they can say, well, that's not admissible evidence. It's data, but we're not going to admit it because in our cult, the only admissible evidence in a court case with a cellular phone company is we want to see 10,000 rats in a laboratory exposed to this, and then we want to see this, and we don't want to see this. And so cults decide what data is admissible and what data is not admissible. And it's not necessarily that the data is more or less real. It's just that the format in which certain data is or is not admissible correlates with a value hierarchy of that cult. And at our stage in human evolution, we've experienced substantial benefits in reliability through using the scientific method. And the scientific method emphasizes reproducible results in a laboratory. That's been a breakthrough point in insight. So the cult has decided that information coming from those channels is significantly more valuable than information coming from other channels. And so it's basically blacklisted certain data in our reality as a way of emphasizing the cult value on certain laboratory tests. And of course, as set theory will point out, the only thing that can fully be seen clearly is something where the observer is outside of the set of the data. So you have to have a laboratory that is bigger than the whole planet in order to, and then you have to have multiple planets in order to really test a planetary theory within a laboratory. But of course, our laboratories aren't that big. And so you have a huge limitation as you try and put something that is more complex than the observing and measuring device into an observing and measuring device of a laboratory with different setups, that it doesn't fit. It can't reproduce the reality. And then you come into the whole problem with time, because if you believe that time is a variable and actually material to a substance, well, how can you do a laboratory test when it's a different time? If you tried to repeat lab experiments on a sunflower, and sometimes it was closed and sometimes it was open and blah, 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 you didn't take into account time. It would make no sense. So in our feelings, we're relatively limited to the feelings we're conscious of. And then we're relatively limited to the feelings that we have words for, which also correlates to consciousness, because you can't think a thought without putting it into words. So we have a very small, and then of course most of us are not lucid in sleep time, so we don't grasp the states and emotions that went on in sleep for the most part. Some small percentage of the population lucidly dreams, and so they can discover states that are permissible and aware in sleep, but not in waking consciousness. But again, we receive no education on traveling the mind in a lucid state, and so we're unaware of it. So we have a very small spectrum there. Now, on the touch spectrum, there's so much of reality that doesn't measure through the nerves of our skin, which is our instrument for measuring touch. And so the vast amount of light and energy that's all around us is, of course, not tracked through this lens. So we see a very small amount of all that could touch us and what actually does. And sound, on the sound spectrum, there's so much sound that is higher than the human ear can hear. And there's so much sound that is lower than the human ear can hear on an infinite continuum. And, of course, we're completely unconscious of that. We're unaware. But even the sound that's within the human frequency, most of it, we don't track. If I asked you what was a bird singing 2 minutes ago, you might or might not be aware that the bird was singing, because we zoom in on certain things that we think are relevant, and we tune out vast amounts of sound, even that is within the human ear range. And of course, taste, with this very small continuum of things that we try and taste. And many of us have an uneducated palate where we've never tasted 99% of the stuff that could be tasted. And our diets, again, there have been 10,000 diets in human history, and now with the multiverse of food, all around the culture, everyone has a somewhat unique diet. And certain people's taste buds are more sensitive than others and emphasize this more than others based on the biology of the body. And so we have a very, very tiny capacity for experiencing the world through taste, or a very tiny reality of experiencing the world through taste. And sight, all the, when the 5 gigahertz frequencies that we're getting, wireless calls on, for example. If we had a different kind of eye, we would see that light, that energy, and that frequency. But our focus through the sense of sight is so limited, we're not aware of it. We rely on a phone. We know it's there, or the phone wouldn't be transmitting a voice, for example. And here you see the phenomenon of synesthesia, because if we could see microwaves or frequencies of different types, then we could actually receive cell phones through, we could receive audio messages through light, the way our phones do. But we don't have that ability. And so we take a high frequency and we translate it from and we downstep it into the audio range, something above the visual range into an audio range. And so it suggests that there's this large fractal pattern of energy that we're piecing together in a very ad hoc kind of way by combining these what we can measure as, and then we call that real. And of course, within the smell, there's all kinds of things that could be smelled. One could smell different types of light if one had the nose for it that translated light into smell. And we have 5 scientific instruments for sensory data. And we piece, and anything that shows up in those 5 arenas, in the conscious domain of those 5 arenas, we call reality. And anything that shows up outside of the terrain that we can see, hear, smell, touch, taste, etc., is not real to us. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist there. And one of the interesting things, if we look at the fractal nature of particles and physical reality, is we know that our world is constructed by atoms. Everything that we see, hear, smell, and touch is constructed out of atoms. But we also know that an atom is mostly space. So we have this little dot, and then we have this thing going around the dot. I think it's a proton and electron circling around one another. So you have this space, and the circle of the pattern in the atom is happening at a certain frequency. And if something is at the same frequency as the thing that it is interacting with, it shows up as solid, because it's very similar to, if we have something here and something moving like this, there's mostly space. But if your hand shows up right where this hand is at the same frequency, at the same moment when it's going around this hand, it's going to feel solid. So this phenomena of solidness, what is solid to a given observer, is that which is operating at a frequency. So if this proton, if this circular rotation with this atom is at a similar frequency as the frequency of rotation of this atom, and they come into contact, then there's a boundary there. But imagine that you're a spaceship at the electron level, and you have a much faster speed than the speed of this rotation. That's what we have in outer space, which is that the Earth is moving around the sun, called a solar system, which is a magnified fractal representation of the atom, or the atom is a microcosm of a solar system. Now, because we are aware of the speed of this rotation, we can pass a spaceship between the Earth and the sun in this vast amount, because an atom is 99% space. It only feels solid because other atoms are doing the vibration at the same speed as each other, so they feel solid. But if you were to fly a spaceship between the Earth and the sun, steering away from the Earth and the sun to go between, there's no resistance whatsoever. It's not solid. You've penetrated the vast majority of the reality, which is the space. And so if you think about what friction, and this ties in with metaphysics, the physics about physics. Metaphysics talks about this phenomena of law of attraction or law of resonance, that if two things are at the same resonance, they will tend to feel more real to one another than two things of a completely different resonance. Meaning, if the spaceship tried to fly through in the orbit between the sun and the Earth at the same moment as its intersection with the Earth, the spaceship would try and fly into the Earth and would discover the Earth was solid. But if it waited an hour and the Earth was out of that space where it made its crossing, then there was nothing solid there. And so if you have a faster speed and intersect with a pattern of energy at a slower speed, you can go right through it. You can enter and exit the orbit before a single orbit has taken place. And similarly, if you're slower, see, in this case, speed is the trump to freedom, is the trump card to freedom, because if you're too slow, meaning, for example, if you can't cross this barrier of the orbit faster, then this makes a complete revolution, then it is experienced as a solid thing. If a spaceship traveled at 1 inch per hour and tried to enter the orbit of the Earth and the Sun, it traveled an inch. In 24 hours, the tip of that spaceship would start to have impact, because the orbit that it's entering, the vibration that it's entering, is happening faster than the object that's trying to penetrate it, so it feels solid. But if you have something 100 times faster than the speed of light, and you've got a 24-hour rotation, 99% of the time it's going to go right through something that would be solid for something that was slower. And these atoms and these molecules and these different substances are traveling at the same speed, so they make contact as opposed to going right through. If this hand was faster than the speed of light, it very well might travel through, or even a radio wave might travel through this. And a radio wave isn't hung up. It doesn't get stuck on the solidness of the hand because it's at a different amplitude than the hand, so it just goes through. And this kind of speaks to the fact that the lowest resonance, the lowest energy that we're dealing with in our lives that isn't released and resolved, etc., is going to make contact with other things that are in that same lower energy, and not just make contact but get stuck, not a traveling through, but a stuckness can occur because neither one is able to vibrate at a faster pace and pass through the object. And so we see mastery and on a human dimension in that terrain where certain people, they recognize it, but they don't get stuck in it. And some of the things that tend to stick are value judgments of an eternal nature, etc. You get stuck in there. If this is bad and this is evil and blah blah blah, and there it is, and that shouldn't exist, but it does. You've hit a wall there, and so there's this part of the picture. Now there's also this density. One of the things that's been put forth, and I like the perspective it gives, is that probability is possibility squared. So it's a multiple of times denser. And so you have all that's possible, and then as certain parts of those possibilities overlap and overlap and overlap, it becomes dense enough to become probable. You think a thought of, oh, I could be halfway around the world right now, and that's a thought. But it doesn't become probable until you start taking certain steps, buying an airline ticket, driving to the airport. As you start to move energy in the direction of a possibility, at some point it condenses to where it's highly probable. You think, well, he wants to go halfway around the world. He's bought a ticket. Technology exists because that has been densified into a reality. There's odds are pretty high, 50-50. It's now probable. At least 50-50 he's going to arrive the next day at that airport. And then when you take a bunch more steps, getting on the plane, getting off, all that, checking in your bag, it becomes actual. You go through a ritual to go from possibility to probability to actuality. And so you have this this increasing of density, which in some ways is attuning oneself to the orbit of that which we are wanting to have a relationship with. The thing to be humble about is that just because we only have 5 portals to absorb sensory input consciously in the infinite spectrum on which that information could be absorbed, meaning we could digest sound above the human ear range. It's very arbitrary what the human ear does and doesn't hear, other than that what it tends to hear is relatively useful for human needs: survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, our hierarchy of human needs. We tend to focus on the things that are most relevant to us maturing in our journey towards meeting our human needs. But there's a humility to understand that what we could be digesting is vastly higher on those frequencies. But reality is infinitely bigger than that, than just what could be digested on these frequencies. We have the dimensions that are unmeasured, meaning it hasn't occurred to us to measure multiple different dimensions, because these are dimensions: a dimension of sight, a dimension of sound, and the dimension to a large extent is defined by language. We just say, if I see it through this thing, it's a sight, and if I see it through here, it's a sound. So a dimension of sound, a dimension of sight. We have a large array of dimensions that we don't have words for and are therefore unmeasured. We have many dimensions that are unknown, just another word for unmeasured. Many dimensions that are unconscious, another word for unknown. We have the vastness of the full spectrum of reality that could be measured. And we even have interesting experiments in subatomic physics where reality dances with the observing and measuring device. Whereas if they measure the reality through this instrument, it shows up here. And if we measure it through this instrument, it shows up there. There's subatomic particles that one measures for a particle and one measures for a wave of the form that a photon will take. And the photon will take whatever form the observer puts up to measure it. And so you have this one photon. It's got to decide, is it going to be a wave or is it going to be a particle? And it'll be a wave if you measure it through a wave device. It'll be a particle if you measure it through a particle device. But how does it know? How does a single photon know which one you're going to use to measure it? It's a very interesting paradox. We have everything that's nonverbal, meaning we cannot have a thought that we don't have language for. And so everything that we don't have language for is nonverbal, but it's also then unconscious. But it is there waiting for a word to describe it and waiting for an attunement process so that we can engage and learn its pattern. We have nonlinear points of reality, because the other thing is we view reality through paradigms, and we're viewing reality through a linear paradigm in which something begins here, and then it goes to here, and then it goes to here, and that what was here causes what's here. But there are nonlinear paradigms. For example, the paradigm where the future creates the present. And we don't tend to focus as much about that because it doesn't fit our paradigm. So there's also a whole set of data that's nonlinear that we don't see when we look through a lens that only lets through linear information. Now, a very good general paradigm for reality is that it is way bigger than the human observer, and that it is way bigger than a human mind can conceive of as possible, which means that if you can imagine it, that it exists somewhere on some dimension. That if you can imagine it, it is real in some dimension. Now, we can play games and say, well, that's just an imagination. That's not real. Well, it's real on the on the dimension of imagination. And it's a very subjective paradigm that says that that's what is and isn't real. And of course, we're relating that to the consciousness that is in the human body. And so we could certainly say that for these five senses, that's not very real. But that's a very different thing from saying that it is not real from any set of senses. Because what about consciousness, again, in that paradigm where if you can imagine it, reality is way bigger than you can imagine. So if you can imagine it, it's there. What about the awareness of consciousness that exists on an imaginal dimension? So if you are a consciousness that is your only sense is of thought or of image, you're a one-sense consciousness where you perceive your reality is human thought. Thought is energy, information, just like anything else. So now this one-sensory consciousness that perceives any human thought that it perceives is real. And its reality is defined by human thought. Well, now it's completely real. It's 100% real as soon as you had that thought that it is aware of, that it is in proximity of. Now that, for that unit of consciousness, that is the reality. Because to a consciousness that does not have an eye to measure the frequency of light, light is not real. If it has the eye that measures the pattern of human thought, that human thought is real. And so what is real is what is observed and measured by the observer in a paradigm where the most honest and humble thing that we can do as very tiny particles in a vast galactic narrative is to be honest about the fact that 99.999% of all reality will never be conscious to us. I'm never going to feel what the vacuum of space feels like around Pluto. I'm not going to be conscious of that, but it is there to be conscious of. I'm not going to get out a tape measure and measure the distance between this star and another star. But that's not to say that it couldn't be done. It's just that's part of the 99.999% of reality that I'm never going to experience because I'm very small in relation to something that is much bigger than 99.999% bigger than me. The planet alone is 999.999% bigger than me. And so I'm not going to even know what it's like to grow up in Turkey because I didn't. I grew up in New York State, England, Cyprus, Canada. I grew up in the places I grew up in. So we have nonlinear reality we're not aware of, including backward flows of time, etc. And we also have the dimensions in which sound is shape. Terence McKenna, in his work with DMT, talked about the fact that in the dimension that is perceivable through DMT, what he experienced consistently were consciousnesses that were simultaneously sound and shape and image. They were that. So as they thought or sang or spoke, their shape and sound changed instantly to be synonymous with the sound spoken, so that they were, in a sense, moving, living words in geometry, in shape. He called them machine elves because the energy was one of a tremendous amount of enthusiastic buoyancy, and yet they didn't speak in words. When they said, look at this, they would become a shape. They would become a sound. And you would get it because you perceived the shape and perceived the sound, not through physical senses, but through a sensory apparatus released in the brain under the influence of a chemical that altered the focus of consciousness to observe reality in a different way than it had been observed normally, where you don't see anymore or feel or become aware of the body senses. You enter a state where you observe and measure reality using different metrics. And suddenly a different reality comes into focus that is consistent with the observing and measuring devices on that level. If we understand how small we are, we understand how big possibility is. Human freedom, something that's highly valued in our culture, requires choice. Choice is the food, the fertilizer, the foundation of freedom. If I'm in prison, there is only one room to occupy. And so the idea of freedom, of movement, as a prisoner in a cell is incredibly limited. Because while I'm still a free person, the amount of options available to me is so low as to make the freedom meaningless. In the larger sense, every cult is a prison. Every cult is a prism, a lens through which to see reality, and a prison, a set of norms that are dictated at birth. You will speak this language. You will use a 10-point number system. You will measure these things and not these things. You will aspire to these things and not these things. You will respond to these words with these words. Every cult is a prism and a prison through which to navigate reality. And it's paradoxical. Every cult will say this is the language. And yet, unless you step into a structure of some kind, you're just in that field of possibility. What brings it down to actuality, the density of actuality, is learning the language. So now, rather than being able to speak infinitely, you can speak the words of your language based on your vocabulary, etc. You've now limited your thought to the thoughts of your cult, but you've simultaneously gained an awareness of your thoughts that you do not have if you learn no language. You have no reference point through which to make sense of it, or certainly to help other people in that language. So the prism and the doorway are synonymous. You have a doorway into a very tiny reality, and the prism and prison of that tiny reality that is our cult. And one of the ways that we can expand that is through travel. to actually learn different cults on the planet and say, well, here's what reality looks like when I'm in this location, and here's what it looks like in this location, and here's what it sounds like. This is the language of this cult. This is the language of this cult. These are the values of this cult. These are the values of this cult. As you become culturally literate, you have freedom to move between the rooms of different cults. As one moves towards reality that is not physical, now you have freedom to, of course, you keep the sensory apparatus, etc., in your body, but you can now explore different inner states. So you have freedom to move in the inner world and the outer world, in this culture and in this culture, through this language and this language, through this location and this location. When you're in a sensory deprivation tank, you have access to different human states than when you're putting out a forest fire in heavy forest fire clothing as a firefighter. Different human states are predisposed. When you take a psychedelic substance, when you smoke a cigarette, when you eat sugar, when you go on a diet, when you fast, each state, each relationship with the outer environment predisposes us to certain mental emotional states. And we can then navigate through those states as we gain mastery, as we gain familiarity. So the main point of this is just to be aware that for almost all of us, we have touched less than 2% of our total freedom through a lack of exposure and attunement to the wider range on the spectrums in which we are defaulting to cult norms. The more conscious we are of the various dimensions available to us, the more we develop observing and measuring devices for experiencing a wider range of environments, the more freedom we develop to see and to feel the world in new ways.